All right, let's dive into one of the most powerful statements in the entire Quran.
This verse sounds incredibly definitive, doesn't it? Like a final moment in religious history. But that raises a big question. How can something timeless be perfected on just one day?
To really get what perfected means, we got to look at what came before this moment.
See, the idea isn't starting from zero, but completing something that was already in progress.
Yeah, the Quran wasn't just dropped into a void. It was building on an ancient foundation.
Take the command for prayer. The Arabic implies the prayer, a specific one they already knew.
So, core practices like prayer and the pilgrimage, they weren't new. They were already there.
And this continuity goes even further, right to the prophets themselves, forming an unbroken chain.
Their role wasn't to cancel previous messages, but to confirm and build upon that same core truth.
The story of Abraham really brings this idea of continuity to life. Check this out. So the Kaaba already existed, and his mission was to establish prayer there, way before Muhammad.
Okay, so if the foundation was already there, what does completion actually mean here?
The key is in the specific Arabic word used, ikmal. It means bringing something to its final form. Think of it like building a house. The foundation was there, the pillars were up, the Quran completed it.
This really reframes the Quran's role. It's not a brand new religion, but a final stage.
So you have one single universal message, and the Quran is its final, protected version.
Which leaves us with a big thought. Is this the final chapter in one single story for all humanity?
Have you ever thought about what it means for a religion to be perfected? It's a huge, powerful idea, right? You find it in some of the most important texts in the world. But here's a thought. What if our common understanding of that word is completely off? Let's dig in and go right back to the source to figure this out.
Okay, here it is. This is the verse from the Quran that really sets the stage. Today I have perfected your religion for you. I mean, that sounds pretty final, doesn't it? But as we're about to see, everything, and I mean everything, hangs on what that one word, perfected, actually means.
So that's the big question, isn't it? When we hear perfection, what are we really talking about? Does it mean wiping the slate clean and creating something brand new, totally from scratch? Or is it something else? Maybe it's the final chapter of a story that's been going on for a very, very long time.
All right, to start cracking this open, our first clues are actually hidden in the language itself, in the original Arabic. And believe me, you'll be amazed at how two tiny little words can shift the entire meaning of this.
So the key Arabic word here for perfected is akmaltu, which comes from the root ikmal. Now, this is super important. Ikmal doesn't mean to create out of nothing. It means to complete, or to bring to fullness. Think about it like this. You're building a magnificent cathedral. Ikmal isn't digging the foundation or even raising the walls. No, it's placing that final, perfect capstone that completes the whole structure.
Now our next clue is even smaller. I mean, it's just two letters. It's the word al, which is basically the Arabic equivalent of the in English. Here's why that matters. When the Quran says as-salah, the prayer, it's not introducing some brand new concept. The implies that its audience already knew exactly what it was talking about. It was a pre-existing, well-known practice.
Okay, so the language itself is pointing us toward existing traditions. But does the Quran back this up in other ways? Oh, absolutely. And the evidence it presents is honestly fascinating.
Just listen to this. This is a prayer from Abraham. We're talking centuries upon centuries before the Quran was revealed. He says, "Our Lord, I have settled some of my descendants in an uncultivated valley by your sacred house, that they may establish prayer." Did you catch that? A sacred house and the act of prayer. These cornerstones of the faith weren't new inventions in the 7th century. They were already ancient institutions.
And let's clear something up about that uncultivated valley. It wasn't just some empty, random spot in the desert. No way. The Quran is telling us this was the location of the sacred house, a major religious hub. So Abraham wasn't just wandering into the wilderness. He was going to the very heart of spiritual life at the time. So let's just recap what was already on the ground, so to speak, before the 7th century. A sacred house, the Kaaba? Yep, it was there. Formal prayer, Salah? Already established. What about pilgrimage, the Hajj, and the idea of charity? Check and check. They were all part of the spiritual landscape. The message wasn't about creating these things from scratch, it was about restoring and perfecting them.
And this idea goes way beyond just a few practices. It's really about a much bigger concept. This vision of a single, continuous divine message
delivered by a long, unbroken chain of messengers throughout history.
You know, a lot of people think of religions as separate things, like new software that comes out and just replaces the old version. But the framework the Quran presents is completely different. It's more like one single core operating system that gets crucial updates and patches over time, all leading to a final, complete, and universal version.
And the Quran says this directly. Check this out. He has ordained for you of religion what he enjoined upon Noah, and what we enjoined upon Abraham and Moses and Jesus. It's explicitly linking them all together. This isn't a break from the past. It's the very culmination of it.
And it doesn't stop there. After listing 18 previous prophets, God's instruction to Muhammad isn't, okay, scrap all that and start over. Not at all. It's the opposite. It's those are the ones whom Allah has guided. So from their guidance, take an example. It's a model of continuity, not of replacement. Build on what they taught.
Okay, so we've looked at the language, we've looked at the history within the text, and we've looked at the whole theological framework. So with all that in mind, let's circle back to our big question. What does perfection truly mean here? Let's put all the pieces together.
You see, perfection here isn't a single static event. It's a dynamic process. First, it builds on the solid foundation of all the past revelations. Second, it corrects any distortions or human-made additions that crept in over time. Third, it addresses the evolving social needs of humanity. And finally, it seals the message in its final, comprehensive, and protected form for all time.
So, in the end, the perfection of religion wasn't about starting from page 1 with a new book. Not at all. It was about writing the final, complete chapter of a timeless story that had been told by messenger after messenger, a story humanity had been part of for ages.
And this really leaves us with a powerful question to think about. If we start seeing faith not as a series of sudden, competing events, but as one continuous story, how does that change our perspective? How does it change the way we see each other, our religions, and our shared human history? Something to really chew on. Thanks for joining me.
Imagine for a second that you are a software engineer, but not just any engineer. You're the chief architect for a massive global system. You've got this incredibly complex, vital program that, well, it basically runs the operating system of a company. Or, you know, for the sake of our discussion today, let's say it runs the operating system of humanity.
That is a high-stakes code base.
Yeah.
A very high-stakes code base.
The highest. Now, like any good software, it has a history. You released version 1.0 way, way back in the day. Then came version 2.0, version 3.0. A few thousand years passed, maybe. And finally, after a long, long development cycle, you are ready to release the ultimate, bug-free, feature-complete version 10.0, the gold master, as they say in the industry.
I like where you're going with it.
So here's the question I want you to hold in your head for this entire deep dive. Does version 10.0 start from scratch? When you hit install, does it delete every single line of code that came before it? Does it, wipe the hard drive clean and rewrite the kernel from a blank screen?
Or, and this is the key, is it a patch? Is it a final, massive update that fixes the bugs, patches the security holes, optimizes the performance, and unlocks the full potential of the architecture that was, well, already there?
That is the fundamental question we are tackling today.
It really is. Yeah. Because if you ask most people, and I mean both insiders and outsiders, how they view religion, specifically the arrival of Islam and the Quran in the 7th century, they tend to view it as a hard reboot.
A blank slate. Year zero.
Exactly. The narrative usually goes something like this, that the world was in darkness. It was the age of ignorance, the Jahiliyyah. People knew nothing, believed in nothing but stone idols, had no connection to the divine. It was spiritual anarchy.
Then suddenly, boom, a switch is flipped. A brand new religion just drops from the sky, totally unrelated to what was happening on the ground, and everything starts from that moment.
But today's deep dive is going to completely flip that narrative on its head. We're going to explore the idea that this hard reboot theory is not only historically inaccurate, but theologically flawed based on the text of the Quran itself.
We're exploring the idea that we aren't looking at a new install at all. We're looking at the final software update for a program that has been running since the very beginning.
And we have a really, really unique source for this one. We aren't just riffing here. We are deep diving into a fascinating lecture by the Turkish theologian, Professor Dr. Mehmet Okuyan.
And honestly, what makes this source material so unique right off the bat is the setting. It just grounds everything.
It really sets the tone. This isn't a university lecture hall with a blackboard. It's not a sterile TV studio with makeup artists. It's not some formal Friday sermon from a grand pulpit.
No, it's so much more intimate and, frankly, much more human than that. This lecture actually takes place in a home in Ankara, and it started as, well, as a condolence visit.
Which is just wild to me. Okuyan mentions early on that his father-in-law had passed away. A group of people came to the house to offer their condolences, to sit with the family. And somehow, and you know how these things go when emotions are high and people are staring mortality in the face. This gathering evolved.
It just transformed.
It shifted from, I'm sorry for your loss, into this profound, high-level theological seminar. Spontaneously.
It's almost poetic, isn't it? You have a setting that is dealing with the immediate, painful reality of death, and the conversation naturally turns to the mechanics of resurrection, the structure of divine law, the history of prophecy.
It grounds the theology in real life. It's not academic theory. It's what does this mean for us right now as we grieve?
And Okuyan is quite a character. If you're picturing a dry, monotone academic just reading from a script, you have to delete that image. He's dynamic, he's witty, and he is obsessively detailed.
He mentions early on that he's working on this massive project, a complete video exegesis, a tafsir of the entire Quran.
And he drops this joke that I absolutely loved. He says that he's going into so much detail, analyzing every letter, every grammar rule, every preposition, that at his current pace, it would take him 500 years to finish.
It's a joke, but it reveals his methodology, doesn't it? He says, it won't finish, but at least let's have an archive. It just shows you the level of granularity he's operating at.
He's not skimming the surface.
Not at all. He's looking at the atomic structure of the text. He believes the miracle isn't just in the broad strokes and the big stories, but in the prepositions and the verb tenses. That's where the code is.
And his mission in this talk is, well, it's radical. And I don't mean political radicalism. I mean the Latin word radix, going to the root.
He wants to strip away centuries of hearsay, of cultural baggage, of what he calls folk religion, and all the drama that has accumulated over the years.
He wants to let the text of the Quran explain itself using strict logic and linguistics.
He's basically saying, stop listening to what your grandmother told you. Stop listening to the folk tales that sound good in a movie, and let's just look at the source code.
So we've got a massive stack of notes to unpack today. We're going to look at how the Quran handles what is basically internet troll-level skepticism, because apparently trolls existed in the 7th century too.
Oh, they definitely did. And we're going to bust the myth that practices like prayer started from scratch with Prophet Muhammad.
We're also going to do a forensic re-examination of the story of Abraham and Hagar, which, spoiler alert, is probably not the story you heard in Sunday school or at the mosque.
Not even close. And then we're going to tackle a very, very controversial topic. The children of Adam and the prohibition of incest.
It is a dense one today, but I promise you, by the end of this hour, it might just change everything about how you read this book. Let's dive right into segment 1, the art of the question.
So Okuyan starts by talking about how questions are used in the Islamic tradition. He contrasts two very, very different types of questioning. And the first type is what he calls the educational question.
And to illustrate this, he brings up a really famous story, a foundational story involving the angel Gabriel.
Yes, the Hadith of Jibril. It's a text that, every student of Islam learns early on. The tradition says Gabriel comes to the Prophet Muhammad in the form of a man.
But the description is very specific.
Extremely specific. He's dressed in incredibly clean white clothes. He has jet black hair. And this is the key detail. There are no signs of travel dust on him.
Which is a huge red flag, right? In the middle of the Arabian desert, you don't just show up looking like you stepped out of a dry cleaner. Someone who looks like that hasn't walked for 5 minutes, let alone across the desert.
Exactly. So he sits down, knee to knee with the prophet, places his hands on the prophet's knees, a very intimate, very direct posture, and he just starts firing off these fundamental questions. What is faith? What is Islam? What is excellence? When is the end hour?
But here's the kicker, right? Gabriel is an angel. He's the angel of revelation. He already knows the answers. The prophet knows that Gabriel knows. So why go through the charade? Why ask a question if you aren't actually ignorant?
And that's Okuyan's point. It's a pedagogical tool.
Yeah.
He points out that in education, you don't always ask because you need to know. You ask to benefit the listener.
You're setting up the answer.
You're framing the knowledge for the students. Gabriel is modeling the Q&A format to teach the companions, the people sitting around the prophet. It's the Socratic method, essentially, but strictly for the benefit of the audience. He's showing them that the question is just as important as the answer.
So that's the good question, the question designed to teach. But then Okuyan pivots, and he contrasts this with the bad question, the mocking question.
The troll question.
And this is where it gets really cinematic. He brings up the story of a specific Meccan polytheist.
Right, and the sources differ a little on who it was, you know. Some say it was a man named Ubay ibn Khalaf, others mention Alas ibn Wa'il.
But the name isn't really the point, is it?
No, not at all. It's the archetype. He's the embodiment of that aggressive materialist skepticism.
So you have to picture the scene. This guy is walking through the desert, and he finds an old bone, not a fresh one, a rotten, crumbling bone that has been bleached by the sun for decades. It's brittle. It's basically just dust holding a shape.
He picks it up. He marches right into the gathering where the prophet is speaking to his followers. And in front of everyone, he just crumbles it in his hand. Crunch. He blows the dust right into the prophet's face.
Talk about aggressive. That's a physical act of disrespect.
It's pure mockery. And then he sneers, "Who here? Who can possibly revive this?" It's not a genuine inquiry. He's strictly looking at the material reality. He's saying, look at the physics, Muhammad. This is dust. Entity is one. The structure is gone. You're telling me this comes back to life. You're crazy.
Now, most of us, if someone did that to us, crumbled a bone in our face and mocked us like that, we'd get defensive. We'd get angry. We might yell at the guy.
Where we just retreat to dogma, right?
Yeah.
We'd say, you just have to have faith, brother. Don't question God's power. That's the easy way out.
Exactly. That's the human reaction. But Okuyan points out that the Quran doesn't do that. It doesn't ignore the troll. It doesn't tell him to just shut up and believe. It takes the question seriously. It answers the logic behind the mockery.
It treats the question as a serious intellectual challenge that deserves a logical answer.
And he analyzes verses 78 to 82 of Surah Yasin, which he calls a three-step logical defense. I want to break these down one by one because this is essentially a toolkit for handling skepticism. It's not about blind faith. It's about logical deduction. What is argument number one?
Argument one is the distinction between insha, which is construction, and isha, which is restoration. The verse replies, say, he will give life to them who created them for the first time.
Okay, let's unpack the logic here because it's deceptively simple.
The logic is this. If you accept that a creator made this thing from zero, from absolute nothingness, then putting it back together after it breaks is, by definition, logically easier.
That makes perfect sense.
But here's the context Okuyan emphasizes, and it's a key historical point we often forget. The Meccan polytheists weren't atheists. They weren't Richard Dawkins in the 7th century.
Right. They believed in a supreme creator God.
They absolutely believed Allah created the universe. They admitted he was the creator. They just didn't believe in the afterlife. They thought, you die and that's it. So the Quran corners them with their own belief.
It's basically saying, okay, let's work with your own premise. You admit he built the car from scratch. You admit he engineered the engine, the chassis, the electronics, all from raw materials. So why do you doubt he can fix a flat tire?
Exactly. The maintenance is easier than the manufacturing. If you can do the hard part, you could definitely do the easy part. It's a very clean argument from precedent.
It's like if you can build a Lego castle from a pile of loose bricks without any instructions, you can definitely put the pieces back together if it falls over.
Right. It's just a reassembly job. But then the Quran doesn't stop there. It moves to argument number two. And this is the one that deals with physics. He calls it the green tree paradox.
The verse says, he who produces for you fire from the green tree. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a nice poetic image, fire, tree, nature. But Okuyan says, no, look at the science. What is a green tree?
A green tree is live wood. It's biologically active, which means it is wet. It is full of sap and water.
And what is fire?
Fire is heat. It's dryness. It's combustion.
They're opposites. Water kills fire. You don't use wet wood to start a campfire. You use dry kindling. If you try to burn a green branch, it just smokes and hisses and fights you.
Exactly. So Okuyan explains that creating something from its opposite is an infinitely harder and more complex process than just reviving something. The Quran is saying, you are doubting revival. Look at nature. God extracts heat from wetness. He brings the opposite out of the opposite.
And he mentioned a specific cultural reference here too, didn't he? Because the Bedouins in the 7th century didn't know about molecular chemistry, but they knew this phenomenon from their daily lives.
Yes, he mentions the mark and afar trees. These were specific types of trees in the Arabian desert. The Bedouins knew that if you took branches from these two trees, even when they were green and fresh and full of sap, and rubbed them together in a specific way, they would spark and create fire.
So for the Bedouin listener, this wasn't an abstract scientific concept. It was a practical daily reality. I see this miracle every day when I make my tea. It's proof of concept right in front of them.
And for the modern listener, it's a statement about energy transformation. Photosynthesis stores the sun's energy, which is essentially fire, in the plant, which is essentially water and wood, and friction then releases it. The logic holds up perfectly. If God can pull fire out of water, he can pull life out of death.
That is just so cool. It's like saying, I can do the impossible physics, so the simple biology is a piece of cake for me.
Which brings us perfectly to argument 3, the scale of creation.
The big job versus the small job.
This is the cosmic argument. The Vos asks, very simply, is not he who created the heavens and the earth able to create the likes of them?
And Okuyan talks about watching deep-sea documentaries here. I love this personal touch. He says he watches these shows about the bottom of the ocean, the Mariana Trench.
Right, and he sees these bizarre bioluminescent creatures surviving under crushing pressure in pitch blackness. And then he looks up at the Hubble telescope images, the galaxies, the nebulae, the sheer mind-boggling vastness of the cosmos.
It puts things in perspective. If you can engineer a galaxy, or a blue whale, or an ecosystem that thrives in a volcanic vent at the bottom of the sea, then reassembling a human being, which is just a little sack of carbon and water, is trivial by comparison.
It's the skyscraper versus toaster argument. If I showed you I built the Burj Khalifa, would you doubt that I could fix your toaster? It's an argument from the greater to the lesser.
Is he not able? And the answer implied is a resounding, yes, of course he is. But then Okuyan dives into a phrase that everyone knows but maybe doesn't understand. Kun feyokun, be, and it is.
Oh, this is a crucial theological correction he makes. This might be the most technical part of this segment, but it's so vital for understanding his entire worldview.
Because usually when we hear be and it is, we think of a magic wand. Poof, instant rabbit, poof, instant universe. God just snaps his fingers and it's done in 0 time.
Right. Instantaneous manifestation. We think of God as a magician. But Okuyan puts on his grammarian hat here. He looks at the verb yakunu. In Arabic grammar, yakunu is in the imperfect tense.
Which means?
It doesn't just mean it happens. It indicates a present and future continuous action. It has a sense of process, of unfolding over time.
So it's not be and it popped into existence. It's more like be and it begins to be. Or be and it continues to become.
Exactly. Be and it becomes. Okuyan argues that while God absolutely can do instant creation, he has the raw power, he chooses saged creation. He chooses process. Look at a plant growing from a seed. Look at a human developing in the womb for 9 months.
He says something beautiful here, that staged creation is actually a higher form of artistry than instant creation.
Yes, instant creation is just raw power. It's impressive, sure. But process creation demonstrates wisdom, artistry, patience, planning, and mercy. Every single stage of the plant growing, from seed to sprout to sapling to tree, is a new creation, a new miracle unfolding.
So it's a constant unfolding miracle rather than a one-time magic trick.
That's a perfect way to put it, and it reframes everything.
It really does. If God uses a process to create you in the first place, and a process to turn wet wood into fire, why do we demand that resurrection be this simplistic, magical poof? It's all part of a system, a divine process.
And that system, that process leads us perfectly into the next segment. Because if creation is a process, then religion itself is also a process. It's a software update, as you called it.
Exactly. Segment 2, completing the religion. Okuyan focuses on a heavy hitter verse, Maid Surah, verse 3. Today I have perfected or completed your religion for you.
The key word here is kamal, perfection, or completion. And Okuyan asks a very simple, very logical question. If I tell you I have completed the building, what does that immediately imply?
It implies the building was already under construction. You can't complete something that didn't start yet. If you build a house from scratch in one day, you say, I built the house. You only say, I completed the house if the foundation was already poured, if the frame was already there.
Precisely. You don't complete a zero. You complete a work in progress. And with this simple linguistic point, Okuyan challenges what we can call the zero-point fallacy.
It's a zero-point fallacy. I like that.
It's this idea that so many Muslims speak as if Islam launched at year 0 with Muhammad, and that before that moment, the Arabs were just wandering around in a total spiritual vacuum.
But Okuyan says, no, they had a din, they had a religion.
They absolutely did.
Yeah.
As we already mentioned, the polytheists believed in Allah. They debated the prophet about his specific claims, about Allah's partners and the afterlife, but they didn't debate Allah's fundamental existence. But more importantly, they had rituals.
They prayed.
They made pilgrimage to the Kaaba, they fasted, they gave charity. These practices existed.
This is where my mind was blown. The linguistic evidence he brings up about prayer. The command Aqimis Salah.
Which is usually translated as establish prayer.
But not just prayer. He points out the definite article, al-salah, establish the prayer.
Yes, the. In English, it's the difference between me saying to you, make a sandwich, and make the sandwich.
Okay, explain that.
Well, if I say make a sandwich, it's indefinite. You have to ask me a bunch of questions. What kind? What kind of bread? Cheese. Toasted. It's a new instruction. But if I say make the sandwich, you know exactly which one I'm talking about. Maybe it's the turkey and Swiss we always have for lunch. It refers to a known quantity. We have a shared understanding.
So when the Quran says establish the prayer, it's speaking to an audience that already has a shared understanding of what that ritual is. It's telling them, do that specific ritual you already know how to do.
Exactly. Okuyan argues that if prayer were a brand new invention of the Quran, the book would need a tutorial section. It would need a user manual.
Chapter 5, How to Pray. Step 1, stand up straight. Step 2, raise your hands to your ears. Step 3, bow at a 90-degree angle.
And does the Quran have that manual?
It absolutely doesn't. It gives general guidelines, but it never, ever explains the physical mechanics from scratch. Why? Because the audience already knew how to pray.
They've been praying at the Kaaba for generations, inheriting the tradition from Abraham.
So the software update theory holds up perfectly. The prophet didn't come to invent the motion of bowing and prostrating. He came to debug the software.
Correct. Okuyan mentions Anfal, verse 35. The Quran criticizes the way the polytheists were praying at the Kaaba. It says their prayer was nothing but whistling and clapping.
That's such a great image. They were at the Kaaba going through the motions, but they had corrupted the whole thing into this noisy, performative spectacle.
Exactly. So the hardware was there, the Kaaba, the idea of prayer, the timings. But the software was corrupted with bugs like whistling, clapping, and idolatry. The Quran comes in, deletes the whistling, clapping bug, installs the spiritual focus and sincerity patch, and says, okay, now, establish the prayer properly.
It purifies the ritual. It doesn't invent it. The same logic applies to Hajj, the pilgrimage, and Zakat, the alms, and fasting too, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fasting didn't start with Islam. The Quran is explicit about this. It says, fasting is prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you. It's an ancient spiritual practice. The Quran is just the final polish, the completion of a structure that started with Adam and was built up by Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and all the prophets.
Speaking of Abraham, this brings us to segment 3. This is the real detective work part of our deep dive. We are rereading the story of Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael. And I have to say, this part really hit me because it undoes so much of the Sunday school imagery I had in my head for years.
It's so powerful because it forces us to confront the stories we tell ourselves versus what is actually written in the book. It's about text versus tradition.
So let's set the scene with the popular narrative, the one we've all been told 1,000 times. The movie version.
Brahma version, as Okuyan calls it. Abraham takes his wife Hagar and his infant son Ishmael. He travels from Palestine all the way down to Mecca. And at that time, Mecca is described as a desolate, empty, barren desert. Absolute zero. No water, no people, no buildings. A wasteland.
He just drops them off. He leaves them a small bag of dates and a skin of water, and he turns around and starts walking away. No explanation.
And Hagar runs after him, pleading, Abraham, are you leaving us here to die? Where are you going? He doesn't answer. Finally, she asks the crucial question, did God command you to do this? He just nods silently.
And she says her famous line, then God will not waste us. And he leaves his wife and baby in the middle of nowhere.
It's high drama. It tugs at the heartstrings. It's a story that emphasizes absolute, blind, unquestioning submission.
But Okuyan steps in and asks a very simple, very human question. Who would do this?
Right. He says, you wouldn't leave your wife and kid on a desolate mountaintop today. If you saw a man do that, you'd call the police. You'd call him the sociopaths. Why do we attribute this level of cruelty to a prophet? Why do we feel the need to make a prophet look like a monster just to create a dramatic story?
He argues that we have dramified religious history at the expense of the text. So he opens up the Quran to Surah Ibrahim, verse 37, and does a forensic analysis. My Lord, I have settled some of my offspring in an uncultivated valley near your sacred house.
Let's break down the clues he finds in that one sentence. Clue 1, near your sacred house.
The Kaaba, the sacred house, it was already there.
Exactly. This is a bombshell. He didn't leave them in a generic, empty void. He left them at a sanctuary, a center, a known sacred location.
So the house existed before the city of Mecca grew around it.
According to this direct reading of the text, yes, the sanctuary was the anchor point. He took them to a place not away from everything.
Okay, that's huge. What's clue 2?
Clue 2 is the grammar of offspring.
This is subtle, but important.
It's very subtle. The Arabic grammar used for some of my offspring implies a plural group. In Arabic, you have singular, you have dual for exactly 2 people, and you have plural for 3 or more. Okuyan suggests the grammar points to a group of people being settled there, not just one woman and a baby.
So it wasn't just Hagar and Ishmael alone against the world.
It implies a settlement mission, a small colony. He was establishing a new branch of his family there.
That changes the whole vibe. It's not an act of abandonment. It's a strategic colonization mission. He's planting a flag for the future.
And that leads to clue 3, the geography. The verse says, uncultivated valley, Garizaran.
Which we usually hear translated as barren.
Right, but the literal meaning is without cultivation. It means no farming.
It means no agriculture. It does not mean uninhabited or dead. You can have a thriving city that doesn't have farms. Think of a trading hub or a sanctuary or, frankly, Manhattan.
That's a perfect comparison. Manhattan has 0 farms, but it's not a wasteland. Okuyan argues Abraham left them in what was likely the most central, safe, and spiritually significant place in Arabia, the sacred house, specifically so they could be at the center of society.
And the goal, which is stated right there in the verse, so that they may establish prayer.
And you don't establish prayer in a vacuum. You establish it in a community. And he prays to God to make the hearts of people to incline towards them. He's setting up a spiritual center, not conducting a cruel survival experiment.
It is just amazing how much the story changes when you stop listening to the movie version and you actually read the script. We prefer the tears and the panic of Hagar running between the hills because it's emotional. But Okuyan says the Quran's version is about dignified, logical, divine planning.
It restores the agency and the dignity of the prophets. They aren't mystics doing irrational things that look cruel to us. They are planners. They are architects laying the foundations of civilization.
So if we accept this idea that religion is one continuous project, a single operating system being constantly updated by different prophets, Okuyan says we have to deal with a big theological controversy, the idea of nusk, abrogation.
Yes. Segment 4, this is the unity of prophecy.
The common belief, or at least a common interpretation, is that new prophets cancel out old prophets. New laws delete old laws.
It's like, sorry, Moses, your laws are now void. Jesus is here with the new patch. Or, sorry, Jesus, Muhammad is here, and everything you said is now canceled and superseded. A hard reboot every time.
But Okuyan rejects that entirely. He says prophets are described in the Quran as muzarik, which means confirmers, and muhaimin, which means guardians or overseers of the previous truth. They don't cancel, they upgrade.
He uses this great analogy here that makes it so clear. He talks about traffic laws or condo regulations.
I love this analogy. It makes a very abstract theological concept so concrete.
He says religion is one. The core morality, don't kill, don't steal, worship. One God, be just, be kind. That never, ever changes. That's the kernel of the OS. That's the Constitution. But the drivers, which is humanity, change. The traffic, which is society, gets more complex over time. So the traffic laws have to adapt.
So, in the time of Moses, maybe the speed limit was 40 because the roads were rough and people were on foot or using carts. Jesus comes, emphasizes yielding to others, being merciful on the road. Muhammad comes along, the highway is paved, there are more travelers, maybe the speed limit changes where we add stoplights and roundabouts.
But the core principle, safe driving or submission to God, is exactly the same. The regulations update based on the complexity and development of the civilization. The core values are eternal.
This leads him to a fierce rebuttal of the Adam's children myth. This is where he gets really controversial for some traditionalists, but his logic is fascinatingly consistent.
The incest debate. It's the classic question. If we all came from Adam and Eve, how did humanity multiply? Who did their kids marry?
And the popular answer, which you find in many classical Islamic books, believe it or not, is that Adam's sons married Adam's daughters, that God temporarily allowed sibling incest to jumpstart the population.
And Okuyan absolutely hates this idea. You can feel the passion in his voice when he talks about it.
He seems personally offended by it, theologically offended.
He is. He calls it a fabrication imported directly from the Bible, specifically Genesis, which, as he points out, Muslims are taught to believe has been corrupted or altered. So he says, you say the Bible is changed, but then you take this incest story and you paste it right into our theology to fill a gap the Quran leaves silent.
He sees it as a huge contradiction, and he uses a brilliant logical argument to dismantle it, involving milk siblings.
The milk sibling argument, it's pure legal logic. In Islamic law, based on the Quran, if two babies who are not related by blood are nursed by the same woman for a certain period, they become milk siblings.
And what does that mean legally?
It means they are forbidden from marrying each other for the rest of their lives. It's as if they were biological brother and sister. The bond of milk, just a fluid, creates a legal barrier to marriage that is equal to blood.
Okay, so now Okuyan's logic is devastatingly simple. If sharing milk, which is just a fluid, a secondary characteristic, makes you siblings and permanently forbids marriage, how could sharing blood, being actual biological brother and sister, ever be permissive, even for a second?
It's an argument a fortiori. From the stronger argument. You can't say the weak bond prevents marriage forever, but the strong bond was once allowed. It makes no logical sense.
He says God does not change his words, quoting Surah Kaf. God doesn't say incest is disgusting and forbidden, except for that one time I needed to boost the population numbers. Okuyan asserts that God's moral standard is consistent and eternal. An act that is inherently wrong doesn't become right out of necessity.
So the obvious question follows. Okay, Professor, if not that, then how do they multiply?
And I respect his answer so much, he says. We don't know the exact mechanism. The Quran says creation started from a single soul or essence, a nafs, and from it created its mate, and from those two spread many men and women. But it doesn't give us the biological wiring diagram.
He implies there could be other explanations. Maybe there were other human-like creations, maybe a biological process we don't understand yet. But his core point is theological. It is far better and more intellectually honest to admit ignorance, to say I don't know, than to accuse God of legalizing incest to solve a math problem.
And he also takes a swing at the Eve from Adam's rib story while he's at it.
Same logic. He says the Quran describes creation from a single soul, a single nafs. It never, ever mentions a rib. That's another story imported from Genesis. The rib story implies Adam married a piece of himself, which again has these weird circular implications. Okuyan just wants us to read the text, not the folklore. He wants to purify the software updates from the user-generated fan fiction that's been installed over the centuries.
This all circles back to his main weapon in this whole endeavor, the language. Which brings us to segment 5, the tool set. Why grammar is theology.
This is where he gets really passionate. He talks about Sarf Arabic morphology, the science of how words change their form and meaning.
He gives the example of the simple 3-letter root word nasara, which means to help.
Just 3 letters, NSR. But from those 3 letters, an expert in the language can spin out, he claims, over 400 variations. Past tense, future tense, command, passive, active, the helper, the one being helped, the place of help, the time of help, the instrument of help. It's like a fractal of meaning packed into 3 letters.
And his point is, you cannot truly understand the depth of the Quran just by reading a translation. You are reading the user interface, but the sophisticated code is in the Arabic morphology and grammar.
And he gives this beautiful example from Surah Yusuf, verse 3. The standard English translation is almost always, we tell you the best of stories.
Which implies that the story of the prophet Joseph is the best story ever told. It's #1 on the charts. Better than Hamlet, better than the Odyssey.
Right. It implies that the word asana, best, is describing the story. But Okuyan looks at the grammar, and he suggests viewing the word asana not as a direct object modifying the noun story, but as a special kind of adverb called a mif'lu mutlaq, an absolute object that describes the verb.
Whoa, slow down. Grammar lesson. What does that actually change in the meaning?
It changes everything. If it describes the verb, which is telling, then the translation becomes, we tell you the stories in the best possible way.
So it's not that the plot of Joseph's life is the only good story. It's that the method of storytelling, the style, the narrative structure, the psychological insights, the pedagogy, is what is miraculous and perfect.
Exactly. It shifts the miracle from the plot to the narration. It opens up the meaning so much. The miracle is in how God tells stories. And this nuance is completely lost in translation. This is why he says you need the code. Without it, you're missing the depth. You're watching the movie in black and white when it was filmed in IMAX 3D.
This has been an incredible journey through just one lecture. It really forces you to reconsider what it even means to be religious.
It completely shifts the definition of faith. Faith isn't about the blind acceptance of stories passed down through generations. It's about rigorous, logical, linguistic engagement with the source text.
So let's wrap this up with the outro. What is the core philosophy we've really uncovered here today?
I think the philosophy is a fundamental shift from hearing religion to reading religion. We spend so much of our lives listening to what our grandmother told us, or what the local imam heard from his teacher, who heard it from his teacher, or what we saw in a blockbuster movie. Okuyan is saying, stop, be quiet, and go to the source code. Read it for yourself.
He emphasizes that the Quran calls itself mubin.
Yes, and it's usually translated as clear. But the technical linguistic meaning is clarifying. It is an active word. The book is an active agent. It explains itself. If you are confused by verse A, the answer isn't in a folktale from 300 years later. The answer is in verse B, or Surah C. The book clarifies itself.
And I want to leave our listener with that final provocative thought Okuyan mentioned.
With a traffic law thought.
He said if the Quran were being updated today, if version 11.0 were to come out, it might contain traffic laws or condominium property acts.
Because those are the complex social structures of our current life.
So, here is the question for you listening right now. The text is completed. Version 10.0 is final. But our traffic, our digital lives, artificial intelligence, bioethics, global finance is more complex than it has ever been. If the Condominium Property Act isn't explicitly written in the text, how do we derive the spiritual traffic laws for the modern digital age using only the source code provided?
That is the challenge of what he would call the intellectual believer. To not just wait for a new update, but to run the existing sophisticated program to solve new problems. To use the core principles of justice and safety to write the speed limits for the digital highway.
Look at your sources with a magnifying glass, friends. Don't settle for the green tree, just being a piece of wood look for the fire inside it.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you on the next one.
Take care.
Today we're looking at a transcript of a theological lecture on Midas Surah verse 3, arguing Islam is a completion of Abraham's tradition, not a new invention.
I've got my red pen ready. Let's get right into it.
So the first thing that really jumps out is this forest for the trees problem, specifically around what gets prioritized.
Yeah, that's the immediate hurdle. I mean, the structural priority of this piece is basically inverted. It buries the lead under just layers and layers of personal rapport building.
Right.
When you look at the transcript, the weakness is it's just so glaring. The piece has a really delayed entry into its core argument because of all these personal stories.
We're talking minutes, right?
Oh yeah, the first several minutes, which is, prime real estate in any audio. It's all about family bereavements, travel schedules between Ankara and Samsun, TV program announcements.
It feels very much like a live room intro, where you're sort of waiting for everyone to find their seats and get settled.
Exactly. And while that works in a lecture hall for a document or, a tighter argument for a wider audience, it just completely dilutes the power of the theological thesis about Dinin Kamale Ermasi.
The perfection of religion.
The perfection of religion. By the time the speaker actually gets to the main point, any listener who isn't, personally invested in his travel plans might have already checked out. You lose all momentum before you even start the car.
I can see that. The listener came for the theology, not the travelogue. So, how do we fix this? What's the suggestion?
The suggestion is to adopt a cold open strategy. You have to place that central, juicy theological hook right at the very beginning.
And the other stuff?
Relegate all those administrative details to like a postscript or a little housekeeping section at the end. You want to grab the listener by the collar, metaphorically, right from the first second. Establish the stakes.
Okay, I like that. A dramatic start. So what would that look like, concretely, for this piece?
Okay, so for example, you take the discussion about the father-in-law's passing, the 100 Questions YouTube program, all of that, and just move it to the end.
Just lift and shift?
Lift and shift. Start immediately with the breakdown of Maida 3. Open with that provocation. Did the religion start with Muhammad, or was it merely perfected by him? You could even draw on that contrast he makes later between Inshat, construction, and Idya, revival.
Oh, that's good.
Imagine opening with a line like, many believe Islam began in the 7th century, but the grammar of Maida verse 3 suggests we're looking at a renovation, not a new build.
That's a much stronger entry. It immediately frames the whole thing as an investigation, not just a friendly chat.
Exactly. It respects the listener's time and their intelligence.
Okay, moving on. The material makes a really strong case for the continuity of religion by
highlighting specific linguistic markers in the Arabic.
It does, and the insights are really deep. But there's a significant barrier to entry here.
The jargon?
The jargon. The heavy reliance on technical sarf, morphology, and these grammar terms, it just creates a wall that a lot of listeners frankly won't be able to climb. The weakness is that section where he lists, the 14 forms of the verb nasara, or the distinction between maf'ul bih and maf'ul mutlaq. It's intellectually rigorous for sure, but you risk alienating anyone who can't mentally visualize those grammatical shifts.
Right. Because if you don't know the grammar, you miss the entire argument about perfection.
Precisely. The delivery is it's opaque. The logic is sound, but if the audience doesn't know what maf'ul mutlaq means, they just feel stupid instead of enlightened. It's like watching a magic trick from the back of the room. You know something happened, but you have no idea how.
So the suggestion here has to be about translation, in a way.
It is. The suggestion is to use functional analogies to explain these concepts instead of just relying on the technical terms. You have to bridge that gap between the scholar's desk and the layman's ear.
Okay, so let's get concrete. How do we make the grammar of, say, al-salat accessible without a whiteboard and a grammar lesson?
Great example. So instead of just saying al-salat has the definite article al and is therefore specific, you compare it to the difference between saying write a constitution versus uphold the Constitution.
Oh, that's sharp. Yeah. Write a constitution implies you're starting from scratch.
Right.
Uphold the Constitution implies it already exists.
Exactly. The latter implies a pre-existing known document. So you apply that to Iqima Salat. If prayer were brand new, the grammar might be indefinite, like perform a prayer. But establish the prayer implies the audience already knows what the prayer is.
That lands the logic without needing a class on the definite article. It turns a grammar point into a logical proof.
It just clicks. And you can do the same for that Yasin Surah example. The green trees and the fire. That part gets so dense with botanical terms.
Yeah, the marsh and ufar trees. I admit I had to look those up.
Most people would. So instead of that, when you're talking about ziddandan yaratmak, creating from the opposite, just focus on the core image, the visual. Say something like, imagine a soaking wet sponge sparking a flame. That is the miracle of the green tree.
I love that. A wet sponge sparking a flame?
It's visual, it's visceral, and it doesn't require a botany degree from the Arabian Peninsula. It conveys the miracle instantly.
That sticks in the mind way better than the names of two trees. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The whole argument is designed to dismantle fabricated cultural stories to get to the Quranic truth.
That is the goal, yes. But the current tone risks triggering defensiveness instead of curiosity. That's the weakness here. The tone gets a little dismissive towards traditional understandings.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Phrases like uyduriyorlar, they are making it up. Or when he's mocking the story of Abraham abandoning Hajar, he asks, would you leave a woman and child on a mountain? That's not really an intellectual question. It attacks the believer's emotional connection to the story.
It feels a bit like a scolding, not a lecture. It puts the listener on their back foot.
It does. When you ask, who would do this cruel thing about Abraham, you're implicitly calling anyone who ever believed that story gullible. You're sort of insulting their prior understanding, and if you do that, they just stop listening to your new one.
So how do you correct without condescending?
The suggestion is to reframe it. Frame the whole thing as a detective mystery or a rediscovery, not a debunking. You shift from this as a lie to let us solve the puzzle the text is giving us.
That's much more inviting. You're not fighting with the audience. You're on the same team, investigating.
Exactly. So let's make that concrete for the Abraham story. Instead of asking who would do this cruel thing, you point to the contradiction in Ibrahim Surah 37 as a clue.
The clue being?
You ask, if the verse says he placed him near your sacred house, Bayt al-Muharram, how can it possibly be a desolate wasteland? The house was already there.
Ah, okay. You make the text the hero.
You make the text the hero that clarifies the confusion. You say, look at the clues the Quran gives us. It mentions the house. The text is painting a different picture than the one we were told. This makes the listener feel like they're discovering a secret truth with you rather than being told they were wrong.
It validates their love for the text while correcting their understanding. A subtle but really powerful shift. Okay, finally, let's dig into the section on the continuity of religious law and the rejection of abrogation.
Right. This is the real theological heavy lifting of the piece. And the argument, it relies too heavily on negation, on what's not there.
Meaning?
The weakness is that it's built on the absence of evidence, like when he says, where does it say Adam's children married each other? But it doesn't fully address the theological why for the changes that definitely did occur.
Okay, so he argues that core pillars like prayer and Hajj were constant, which is a strong point.
It's very persuasive, yes. But it brushes over the evolution of specific laws, like the prohibition of sibling marriage. He just denies it was ever allowed, calls it a Bible fabrication. But then he doesn't offer a Quranic alternative for how early humanity propagated.
And that leaves a pretty big logical hole.
A massive one. If you just say it's not in the Quran so it didn't happen, you have to answer the question, so how did humanity populate? If you reject one theory, you have to replace it with something else. Otherwise, the logic just collapses on itself.
So the argument needs to handle that nuance between the things that never change and the things that do. It can't just be a blanket, that never happened.
Exactly. So the suggestion is to strengthen the logic by making a clear distinction between deen, which is the core religion or faith, and sharia, the law or method. You can acknowledge that while the deen of submitting to one God is constant, the social laws, the sharia, might evolve. That gives you a framework for historical differences.
How would you articulate that in the script without getting lost in academic terms?
So for a concrete example, when he's talking about the 2 sisters in one marriage rule or changes to Ramadan prohibitions, instead of just challenging the audience to find the verse where it was allowed before, you articulate the principle of legal evolution. You could say something like, the destination, monotheism, is always the same, but the map, the sharia, it updates based on the terrain of the era.
I like that. The map updates.
Yeah. If the argument is that the principle never changes, then clarify that the methods, like the direction of Qibla or specific dietary rules, are part of that perfection process.
That clarifies things a lot. It's not that the previous laws were wrong, but that they were for a different time, a different map.
Exactly. Or if he wants to insist they were fabrications, he has to provide the alternative mechanism. For Adam's children, just saying it's a lie from the Bible is an emotional argument, not a logical one, unless you can say, and here is the Quranic alternative for population growth.
Right.
He has to either say the Sharia of Adam allowed things the Sharia of Muhammad forbids, or he has to provide the Quranic answer. That distinction between perfection of religion and evolution of law just needs to be much, much sharper.
That really gets to the heart of it. It makes the argument feel robust, not brittle.
Yeah, you want it to be bulletproof. Right now, a skeptic can just poke that hole. By framing it through deen versus Sharia, you close that loop. You move from just shouting no to actually explaining how.
This has been a very thorough critique. Let's just quickly recap the main points for our listener.
Let's do it.
First, tighten that intro. Use a cold open on Ma 83 to hook the audience immediately. Second, translate the technical grammar into functional analogies. Use the Constitution for al-Salah and the wet sponge fire for the Yasin imagery.
Third, soften that combative tone. Don't attack the believer. Invite them to solve a mystery with you. And finally, clarify that distinction between the unchangeable faith, the deen, and the evolving law, the sharia. That'll close the logical gaps.
It's a fascinating lecture, really deep insights. But these shifts will make the argument so much more accessible and, honestly, much harder to dismiss.
Absolutely. It transforms it from a sermon for the choir into a persuasive argument for everyone else.
We would love to see how this material transforms. Please submit the revised material for another round of critique. We'd love to see where you take it.
Can't wait to read the next draft.
Until next time.
Welcome to the debate. Today we are wrestling with a lecture that really fundamentally challenges the timeline of faith. We're looking at Professor Dr. Mehmet Okiyan's analysis of Dinin Kamale Ermese, or The Perfection of Religion.
And honestly, the title sounds like a pretty standard Sunday school topic. But the content is, well, it's anything but. Dr. Okiyan is essentially taking a sledgehammer to the popular understanding of Islamic history. The central question we're debating today is, when the Quran says, "This day I have perfected your religion for you," is that a graduation ceremony for a completely new faith, or is it more of a restoration project for a very, very old one?
It's the difference between a clean slate and a masterpiece restored. And I'm going to be arguing for the position of continuity. The source material presents a rigorous, evidence-based argument that Islam didn't begin in the 7th century. It wasn't an invention, it was a purification of a single continuous tradition stretching all the way back to Adam. The Quran didn't introduce prayer or pilgrimage, it rescued them from human corruption.
And that is exactly where I have to push back. I'll be taking the position of innovation. While I accept the historical roots that Dr. Okian points out, I believe the correction he describes is so severe, so surgical, that it effectively constitutes a new religion. I mean, if you have a house that's been burned down to the studs and you rebuild it with different materials and a different blueprint, you can't just turn around and say, oh, it's the same house. It's a new institution. The perfection creates a functional break from the past, not just some smooth continuation.
Well, let's start with that word, perfection, because Dr. Okian is obsessed, and I think rightfully so, with the linguistics here. The Arabic term is ikmal, and linguistically, you cannot perfect or complete a zero. If I'm building a wall and I place the final brick, that is ikmal. That implies the wall was already there. If there was no wall, I'd be starting a foundation, not perfecting a structure.
I understand the linguistic argument, I do, but does it hold up against the theological reality on the ground? The source acknowledges that the people receiving this message, the Meccans, were polytheists. They were worshiping idols. So to say you are perfecting their religion feels like a stretch. You are dismantling their religion.
But that's the misconception the source tries to correct. The Meccans weren't atheists, and they weren't, entirely disconnected from the truth. They believed in a creator. They accepted Inshat, the initial creation. If you ask them, who created the heavens and the earth, they would say Allah. Their stumbling block wasn't God. It was Ihya, resurrection. They couldn't grasp the logic of bringing the dead back to life.
Which is a massive theological gap. I mean, that's not a minor detail.
True, but look at how the Quran bridges that gap. It doesn't just ask for blind faith. It uses their existing belief to prove the new concept. Dr. Okian highlights the metaphor in Surah Yasin of the green tree yielding fire.
The fire from the green tree. It's poetic, sure, but is it really a logical proof?
It is absolutely a logical proof, and it's based on opposites. The green tree it's wet, it's alive, it's full of moisture. Fire, on the other hand, is dry, hot, consuming. The Quran is challenging the skeptic. You already accept that the Creator brings dry fire out of wet wood. You see this opposite emergence every day. Why is it harder for you to believe you can bring living man from dry dust? It connects Insha, creation, to Ishya, resurrection, using a bridge they already walked on. It's not a new religion, it's a perfection of their logic.
I'll grant you the logical bridge is elegant, but let's look at the practice. You claim this is continuity, but the source itself admits that the Meccan version of prayer had devolved into, and I'm quoting the text here, whistling and clapping near the Kaaba. That's not prayer. That's a sporting event.
It was a corrupted form, yes.
It was a useless form. If the known practice is whistling, then the correction offered by the Quran is a total overhaul. And this brings us to my main issue with your continuity argument, the so-called known prayer. You argue that because the Quran says pray, they knew what to do. But if they were whistling, they clearly didn't know what to do.
Ah, but you're missing the grammatical nuance that Dr. Okian stakes his entire argument on. The command isn't just a do prayer, it is ikum as-salat. Note the definitive article the prayer.
The specific prayer.
Exactly. Grammatically, this implies a specific known entity to the audience. The source uses a brilliant analogy here. If you go to a doctor and he tells you you need to take a shower every day, you don't look at him confused and ask, "Doctor, what is a shower?" You know the mechanics of a shower. You might not be doing it, or you might be doing it wrong, but the concept and the form are known to you.
Hold on, I have to stop you there. That analogy assumes the patient knows what a proper shower is. In the case of the Meccans, their shower was standing in the rain and whistling. If a patient thinks taking a shower means rolling in the mud, the doctor does have to explain the mechanics. He has to say, No, turn on the water, use soap, rinse.
But the Quran doesn't do that. That's the smoking gun. The Quran details inheritance laws down to the tiniest fractions, 1/6, 1/8. It details divorce proceedings, but it never, ever says, bow this way, put your hands on your knees, prostrate like this. Why would a book that is so specific about inheritance be completely silent on the mechanics of the most important daily ritual?
Because it's assuming a lot? I don't know.
No, because the audience already knew the form. They were the descendants of Abraham. The ritual form, standing, bowing, prostrating, was in their cultural DNA, even if they had filled it with noise. The Quran says, establish the prayer, because it's pointing to the Abrahamic model they had corrupted, not introducing some strange new yoga.
I see your point, but I think you're underestimating the word ikame, establish. The dissenter position here is that establishing prayer is fundamentally different from just performing a ritual you inherited from your grandfather. The Quran isn't just saying fix your posture, it's saying take this hollow shell you call prayer, which has zero moral impact on you, and establish it as a mechanism that restrains you from shameful deeds.
That is the purification of intent.
It's more than intent, it's function. I mean, if I take a car that doesn't run and I replace the engine, the transmission, and the driver, is it the same car just because I kept the chassis? The Meccan whistling had no social function. The Quranic prayer is a social identity builder. That is a new institution regardless of whether they bowed or not. The perfection here is a transformation so deep that calling it continuity feels like a euphemism.
I think we have to agree to disagree on the extent of the damage, but this renovation versus new build debate, it gets even hotter when we look at the narratives. Dr. Okuyan isn't just talking about prayer. He's talking about history. And this is where he starts stripping away what he calls the İlahiyat, the biblical or cultural importations.
Right. This is the part of the lecture that feels less like theology and more like, archaeology. He's digging through the text and throwing out centuries of stories that we've all just accepted as fact.
He's throwing out the debris to find the foundation. Let's talk about Hajar and Ishmael. The standard narrative, what you hear in sermons, what's in all the history books, is that Abraham took Hajar and his infant son and just abandoned them in a desolate valley. He left them there with a bag of dates and some water and walked away.
And Hajar asked, did God command you to do this? And he says, yes. It's framed as this ultimate test of tawakkul, complete reliance on God.
And the source argues it is a slander against a prophet. Dr. Okuyan is adamant. Why would a sane man, let alone a prophet of God, take his family and dump them in a wasteland to die? The Quran never says he abandoned them.
It says he settled them in a valley without cultivation.
Exactly. In Surah Ibrahim, Abraham says, I have settled some of my offspring in an uncultivatable valley near your sacred house. He didn't just drop them in the middle of nowhere. He took them to a specific destination, the Kaaba, or at least the foundations of it.
So it wasn't exile. It was more like a deployment.
Precisely. It was a strategic mission to establish prayer. The term Gairi Zarin means uncultivatable, no agriculture. It doesn't mean no water or no people. The source argues he placed them in the center of what would become a future civilization. This completely flips the script from a tragic test of abandonment to a visionary act of settlement.
I admit, the strategic settlement framing is powerful. It really restores agency to Abraham. But here is the problem with this Quran-only methodology. When you start stripping away tradition, you leave these gaping holes in the narrative that people struggle to fill. Let's look at the story of Eve.
The rib story.
Right. The vast majority of Muslims, influenced by the Bible and Hadith, believe Eve was created from Adam's rib. Dr. Okuyan rejects this categorically. He calls it a fabrication.
Because the Quran says humanity was created from a single soul, nafs. It never mentions a rib. To attribute the rib story to God is, according to the source, slandering the Creator. It implies a derivative status for women that the text just doesn't support.
Fair enough, but then he goes further. He tackles the incest issue. The traditional explanation for how the human race propagated from Adam and Eve is that their children married each other. Brother married sister.
Which Dr. Okuyan calls the biggest incest and a moral disaster. He argues that God never allowed siblings to marry, not even for Adam. If it's haram, forbidden now, it was haram then. God's moral compass doesn't just change based on population density.
Okay, but this is where the dissenter in me just screams, wait a minute. If you reject the rib and you reject the sibling marriage, how did we get here?
The text doesn't say.
And that is a massive problem. Human beings are narrative creatures. We need the how, the tradition, the rib, the intermarriage. It provided a logical, albeit uncomfortable, mechanic for population growth. If you strip that away because the Quran is silent, you leave the audience staring at a biological mystery. The source suggests we should look at the creation verses more broadly, perhaps implying a wider pool of initial humans or a different process. But it refuses to commit to a theory.
And that refusal is the point. The perfection of religion requires intellectual humility. The source uses this glasses metaphor. For centuries, we have been reading the Quran through biblical glasses or cultural glasses. You put on the glasses and you see a rib. You put on the glasses, you see incest. Dr. Ukuyan is demanding we take off the glasses.
But without the glasses, the picture's blurry.
No, the picture is honest. If the Quran is silent on the mechanism of propagation, then we must respect that silence. We shouldn't fill the silence with stories that insult the dignity of the prophetic lineage just because we want a neat ending. The continuity I'm arguing for is a continuity of dignity and logic. We don't need to invent incest to explain creation.
But silence is heavy. It creates a vacuum. And historically, when you create a vacuum in religion, people fill it with superstition. I would argue that by rejecting the tradition, you aren't just cleaning the lens, you're removing the very frame that held the picture together for millions of people. It's a risky move.
It's a necessary move if you want the truth. And this brings us to the ultimate theological stake here, the one religion theory. If we strip away all these cultural additions, what are we left with?
The source claims we're left with Islam, not just as a final religion, but as the only religion.
Exactly. Surah, verse 13. He has ordained for you of religion what he enjoined upon Noah and that which we have revealed to you, and what we enjoined upon Abraham and Moses and Jesus. The argument is that there is no such thing as Judaism or Christianity as separate divine projects. There is only one project, surrender to the one God.
I get the theological unity. It's very appealing to say we are all one. But the source trips over itself when it deals with the law, the Sharia. Dr. Okan himself admits that the rules changed. He cites Nahl 118, which mentions that certain foods were made haram for the Jews specifically as a punishment for their rebellion.
We forbade them what we have related to you before.
Right, so the Jews had a stricter diet than the Muslims. That means the law changed. If the law changed, then the religion changed. If I can't eat camel meat, but you can, we are practicing different religions.
You're confusing the Constitution with the municipal code. The source makes this distinction very clearly. The deen, the religion, is the Constitution. It covers the core beliefs: Tawhid, oneness of God, the afterlife, prophethood, moral accountability. That never changes. Noah didn't preach a different God. But the Sharia, the law, is like traffic rules.
Traffic rules?
Yes. In the time of Moses, maybe the spiritual traffic was heavy or the people were reckless, so God lowered the speed limit. He made the dietary laws stricter. In the time of Jesus, maybe the rules were relaxed. In the time of Muhammad, the final traffic code was released. The speed limit might change from 40 to 60, but the government hasn't changed. The road hasn't changed. The destination hasn't changed.
That's a convenient metaphor, but to the driver, the speed limit is the reality. If I get a ticket for doing 50 in a 40 zone, I don't care about the Constitution, I care about the fine. The dissenter argues that these legislative changes matter. They create different lived experiences.
They create different disciplines, not different faiths.
But doesn't the concept of the Quran being a muhaimin protector or guardian over previous books, doesn't that imply that the previous versions were functionally broken? You don't put a guard in front of a building that is safe. You guard something that is under attack or crumbling.
They were broken by humans. That is the critical distinction. The perfection isn't God fixing his own mistakes. It's God removing the human graffiti from the wall. The source says the Quran explains most of what they used to hide. It is a corrective lens. It overrides the previous laws, not because the old laws were bad, but because the old laws had been tampered with or were just temporary.
I think we're looking at the same process and seeing two different things. You see a restoration of a pristine past. You see the Quran as a pressure washer just cleaning off the grime.
That's a good image.
But I see a radical modernization. I mean, think about what Dr. Okuyan is asking. He is asking the believer to reject the stories they heard on their grandmother's knee. He is asking them to reject the interpretations of scholars who lived 800 years ago if they contradict the strict grammar of the text. He is asking them to ignore the whistling prayer of their ancestors and build a new spiritual identity. That is not just cleaning, that is a revolution.
But isn't that what perfection requires? If the religion was perfected on that day in the 7th century, it means no human addition can improve it. When we add the rib story or the emotional drama of abandonment, we are implicitly saying God's version wasn't interesting enough. We are trying to decorate the perfection.
Or we're trying to survive it. The pure version Dr. Okuyan proposes is stark. It's logical, it's rational, but it's very lean. It lacks the folklore that comforts people.
It lacks the falsehoods that confuse people. The perfection of religion is a declaration of independence from human narrative. It's God saying, I have finished the structure, you don't need to add extensions to it.
And I would argue that perfection is a dynamic process. It's not a static museum piece you just visit. By constantly engaging with the text and stripping away those layers, as the source suggests, we are actively participating in that perfection. It's not that the religion was perfect and we forgot. It's that the effort to understand it must be perfect.
That's a beautiful way to put it. A continuous effort for a continuous faith.
Precisely. Whether you view it as a restoration of Adam's faith or a radical correction of Meccan errors, the methodology remains the same. Read the text, not the tradition.
And take off the glasses.
Even if the light hurts your eyes a little bit. Because once you see the green tree logic or the strategic settlements of Hajar, you can't really unsee it. You can't go back to the fairy tales.
And that is the challenge the source leaves us with. It demands intellectual courage.
And a lot of reading.
We hope this discussion has illuminated the depth of Dr. Okuyan's work on the perfection of religion. It's a topic that forces us to ask how much of our faith is in the text and how much is just what we were told.
Keep questioning and keep reading.
Until next time, this has been The Debate.